Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're digging into a set of sources today, all focused on a nation's really intense struggle for identity and independence. This is part two of our look into Eritrea's fight for liberation. We're picking things up right after that UN decision in the early 50s, the one that federated Eritrea with Ethiopia. Not full independence, but, well, supposed autonomy. And our main guide here is this text, Eritrea, a Nation Forged Through Struggle, Part 2. It really maps out this critical and frankly quite dramatic period.
It really does. And what's so key here, I think, is how this moment of apparent compromise, this federation idea, just starts to fall apart almost immediately. It didn't solve anything, really. It actually set the stage for decades of conflict. So our mission, you could say, is to trace that path. How did that initial hope, embedded in that UN resolution, turn into a full-blown armed struggle?
Okay, let's get into it. So recapping from last time, UN Resolution 390V, December 1950. It sets up this federation. Eritrea is an autonomous unit under the sovereignty of the Ethiopian crown. Eritrea handles internal stuff, legislature, courts, its own executive. Ethiopia handles defense, foreign policy. That was the plan, right?
That was the plan on paper, yes. But the source makes it really clear there was a fundamental problem from the outset. Emperor Haile Selassie's government, his absolute monarchy, just didn't see it that way. They viewed the federation with, well, disdain is the word used. For them, Eritrea wasn't a partner. It was territory to be fully absorbed, a completely different perspective.
Right, so this wasn't just a minor disagreement on details, it was fundamental.
Exactly, a collision course, really.
So how soon did that become obvious? Was there like a specific event that just laid it bare?
Oh, definitely. The text highlights a really striking moment only a few years later in 1955. The emperor's representative gives this speech to the Eritrean assembly, and it's incredibly blunt. He says, and this is basically a direct quote from the source material, "There are no internal or external affairs as far as the office of His Imperial Majesty's representative is concerned. The affairs of Eritrea concern Ethiopia as a whole and the emperor."
Wow. No internal affairs. That just completely negates the entire premise of the Federation, doesn't it?
Precisely. It's about as clear a statement of intent as you could get. Complete disregard for Eritrean autonomy.
Okay, so after a statement like that, how did things proceed? What did Ethiopia actually do to dismantle the structure?
Well, the source shows it wasn't just one thing. It was systematic, a deliberate process over the next decade or so. They started chipping away at it almost right away. One early example mentioned is Proclamation 130.
What did that do?
It basically put Eritrea's highest court, its court of appeal, under the Ethiopian Supreme Court. So right there, undermining judicial autonomy.
And that was just the start.
Oh, yeah. It escalated. The source says they eventually just abolished the entire Eritrean constitution.
The whole thing?
The whole thing, the legal basis for the federation, gone. Then they replaced the Eritrean flag with Ethiopia's flag.
A very powerful symbol.
Absolutely. Erasing identity. And then, crucially, the language issue. They imposed Amharic as the official language. Eritrean languages like Tigrinya and Arabic were banned in schools and official business. Think about the impact of that on daily life, on culture.
Yeah, that cuts deep.
Yeah.
And the source mentions it wasn't just legal and cultural pressure, but economic and political too.
Right. It was a multi-pronged approach, really. The text talks about quite draconian measures, things like forcing elected local Eritrean leaders to resign, just removing that layer of local government.
And economically.
Economically, they squeezed Eritrea, confiscating its customs revenues, which were vital, apparently pressuring foreign investors not to invest in Eritrea, and siphoning off tax money and profits from Eritrean industries back to Ethiopia.
So economic strangulation on top of everything else.
Kind of feels that way, reading the account.
So faced with all this, the legal dismantling, the cultural suppression, the economic pressure, how did Eritreans react? Surely there was pushback.
Oh, absolutely. The text is clear. This wasn't just accepted passively. Peaceful opposition definitely emerged. It mentions large student demonstrations in 1957 and then again in 1962. Shows you the youth were mobilized.
Students often are at the forefront, aren't they?
Yes. And beyond that, there was a really significant general strike in February 1958, organized by underground trade unions. It lasted 4 days, and the source says it brought the country almost to a complete standstill. That shows pretty broad resistance.
A general strike. That's a major statement. How did the Ethiopian authorities respond to these peaceful protests and strikes?
The response described is, well, it's brutal. Ethiopian troops used lethal force against the protesters, against the strikers. The source mentions dozens killed, many wounded, hundreds arrested.
So peaceful resistance met with violence.
Yes. And prominent nationalist figures, people like Woldemariam and Ibrahim Sultan, who had been trying to work within the system, they were forced into exile. But even from exile, they kept organizing, so the movement wasn't easily crushed.
Okay, so internal resistance met force.
Hmm.
What about the outside world? The UN. I mean, the UN set this whole thing up. Resolution 390 supposedly gave Eritreans the right to appeal if the terms were violated, did they? What happened?
They did appeal. Repeatedly, according to the source, Eritrean leaders sent petitions, protested the violations, but the response from the UN and the wider international community is described in the text with one phrase: deafening silence.
Deafening silence.
Yeah. Despite the fact that the resolution itself, 390A, explicitly stated only the UN General Assembly could change the federation, that commitment just wasn't upheld. The international community basically failed to enforce its own resolution.
That's a really stark failure. So you have the internal dismantling, the violent repression, and now international abandonment. What was the final straw?
Well, as the source puts it, Eritreans' hopes and faith in the United Nations waned. You can understand why. The breaking point, the really decisive act, came in November 1962. Emperor Haile Selassie just formally dissolved the Eritrean parliament by force and annexed Eritrea, declared it Ethiopia's 14th province. Done.
Just like that. Dissolved parliament, annexed the territory.
Pretty much. The text notes that Western observers at the time called it a putsch, an illegal seizure of power, and a brutal and arbitrary act. It also mentions that Eritreans largely refused to participate in any kind of staged celebrations Ethiopia tried to organize around the annexation.
So this annexation, it wasn't the end of Eritrean nationalism, was it? It sounds more like a catalyst.
Exactly. That's precisely how the source frames it. This final betrayal, this complete destruction of the federal arrangement, it didn't crush the movement. It galvanized it. It basically proved beyond any doubt that peaceful protest, working within the system, appealing internationally, none of it worked. That path was closed.
So it pushed them towards something else.
It pushed them towards armed struggle. The source quotes one scholar saying after being 3 times denied their dreams, referring to earlier disappointments, the Eritreans now had no other recourse than to take their destiny into their own hands. And crucially, the text argues that the international silence on the annexation, on the breaking of the Federal Act, specifically nudged them to resort to armed struggle as the only option.
The only option left. And the source gives us a specific date for when that armed struggle officially began.
It does. September 1st, 1961, that's the date pinpointed. A man named Hamid Idris Sawate, described as a respected former soldier, already a known rebel figure, fired the first shots.
Where did this happen?
In the Gash Barka region, he led a small group. The source mentions they started with just a handful of aging rifles. That was the beginning of what would become a 30-year war, born out of that sense of having no other way forward.
A 30-year war. Starting with just a few old rifles. Were there immediate costs?
Yes. The struggle claimed lives early on. The text mentions Abdu Muhammad Faid becoming one of the first martyrs just a few months later, near Sawa. Await himself, the man who fired the first shot, actually died of illness about 10 months into the revolution. But the spark had been lit.
So summing up this whole trajectory, this shift from a UN-backed federation meant to provide autonomy to the start of a massive armed conflict triggered by annexation. How does the source characterize why this happened?
From the perspective presented in this text, the armed revolution wasn't some preferred choice. It's described as, and I'm quoting the sentiment here, the expression of the indignation of a people whose rights were flagrantly and ruthlessly suppressed. It was framed as the absolute last resort. The only path remaining after every other avenue, international law, peaceful protest, political negotiation, had been systematically blocked or betrayed.
So we've traced this path, how that initial promise of federation just crumbled under, well, systematic pressure from Ethiopia.
Right.
And critically, under the silence from the international community that was supposed to guarantee it. And this failure led directly, inevitably it seems, to the start of a long, incredibly difficult armed struggle.
Yeah, and I think this deep dive into this part of Eritrea's story really underscores a tough lesson that comes through in this account. When international agreements aren't upheld, when peaceful dissent is met with force and appeals for help are ignored, it can leave people feeling utterly cornered, feeling like they have no choice but to take up arms to fight for their basic rights, their dignity. All other doors were shut.
It's a heavy history. And as you listening reflect on this, maybe think about the real weight of those international commitments, especially when they involve smaller nations or specific promises of autonomy. What happens when those promises are broken or just quietly abandoned? What really stands out to you about this specific shift we've talked about today, from that hope of federation to the grim necessity, as they saw it, of armed conflict? Something to consider.